Hi, my name is Sophie Goggin, and you're listening to Cold Case, where I'm breaking down and looking at the potential motives of the murders of Jack the Ripper. Each episode is focused on what's known as his canonical five. These are the 5 known victims of Jack the Ripper during his spree in London's East End in 1888. Our guest today is Willow LaJoy. She is a student at Falmouth Academy, and she is interested in learning more about the case. So she's going to be with us for the second episode. This episode will be discussing his second canonical victim, Annie Chapman. Hi, Willow. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Soph. Thanks for having me.
The Jack the Ripper murders occurred in the East End of London in 1888, and although he was only a threat to a small section of the community, in a small part of London, the crimes had a huge impact on society as a whole. On the previous episode of Cold Case, Faye and I discussed his first canonical victim, Mary Nichols. So if you have not listened to that episode yet, I suggest listening to it right now. So for today's episode, we will be discussing the murder of Annie Chapman, who, as I said, was Jack the Ripper's second confirmed kill. She was murdered on September 8th, 1888. At around 5:30 a.m. that morning, Mrs. Elizabeth Long was walking along Hanbury Street, where she passed Annie Chapman talking to a man directly outside number 29 Hanbury Street. She heard the man say, "Will you?" to which Annie replied, "Yes." At around 6 a.m., not even half an hour after this meeting, John Davis, a resident of 29 Hanbury Street, found her mutilated body in the backyard of 29 Hanbury.
That's crazy. How did they find her? What was going on?
That's a great question, Willow. So, a little before 6 a.m., John Davis, who was an elderly resident of 29 Hanbury Street, came downstairs and walked along the narrow passageway and opened his back door. The sight that met his eyes sent him reeling back into horror. Moments later, 2 workmen walked along Hanbury Street, and they were suddenly startled when, from the door of number 29, this man came stumbling into the street. "Men," he cried, "come here." Nervously, they followed him along the passageway and looked into the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, where they found the body of Annie Chapman lying on the ground between the steps and the wooden fence. Her head was turned towards the door, her face and hands were covered in blood, and her hands were raised and bent with the palms toward the upper portion of her body, giving the impression that she had been struggling and had fought for her throat. After a few moments, they ran down the alley and into the main street, where they were obviously looking for policemen. One of the men raced up Commercial Street and headed to the Spitalfields Market, where he encountered a police officer on duty. He pointed out the news of their find and was somewhat taken aback when the officer curtly informed him that it was against procedure for him to leave his post. He was so angered by the officer's attitude that he later made an official complaint to the police station across the street.
Since her skirt was up, would you say that she was raped before or after death?
Well, actually, contemporary medical examinations of the victims of Jack the Ripper reported that there was never any evidence of rape or anything of that nature. Arguments have been made that he could have, but there was never any evidence at the time, nor now that we can find from pieces of clothing left over and, other evidence that we still have that he ever did. So, Dr. Bagster Phillips is back. He arrived around the scene at 6:30 a.m. as the crowd was still outside. His testimony recalled what he saw. A quote from his testimony states that the body was terribly mutilated and that the stiffness of the limbs was not marked but was evidently commencing. He noticed that the throat was dissevered deeply and that the incisions through the skin were jagged and reached right around the neck. On the wooden paling between the yard in question and the next, smears of blood corresponding to where the head of the deceased lay were to be seen. These were about 14 inches from the ground and immediately above the part where the blood from the neck lays. Her mutilated body had many different cuts, and he did not just go for the throat, he also went for different parts of the body. So the throat was severed by 2 deep cuts. Her abdomen had been cut entirely open, and a section of flesh from her stomach was placed upon her left shoulder, and another section of skin and flesh, plus her small intestines, had been removed and placed above her right shoulder.
That's insane. Was there any method to this? Was there any, was it a clean cut? What?
Well, so the throat of Annie's was cut jagged, but the throat of Mary, his first victim, was clean cut. And that was most likely due to the fact that Mary was drunk and Annie was not, and Annie fought back more than Mary did.
So was that the cause of death, the cutting of the carotid artery?
So it was, yes. The throat had the 2 deep cuts, and it got the arteries right in the right spot, and she bled out on sight. Even though the other injuries and the abdomen's entire, disgusting.
Outside of the body.
Yeah,
That's
that was
crazy.
not.
How long did he have?
So it was only about 30 minutes. He was seen with her at 5:30 a.m., and they were, as I said, in front of 29 Hanbury Street. But at 6 a.m., Jack the Ripper was gone, and that's when the resident came out and saw her there. So we can assume it was probably between 20 to 25 minutes for sure. It could have been less, but what he did in that time reveals to police officers and detectives even now that he had intense knowledge of the body and intense medical knowledge to know exactly where these intestines were and how to remove them.
Yeah.
And although it was not done when she was alive, it was done post-mortem.
Extremely quick and clean cuts.
Yeah, without anyone coming along on the street.
Yeah, he
It's
must have
risky.
had a lot of skill.
Yes, he did. One of the suspects was actually a doctor from America.
Yeah.
Who had been over there for the year, and that's why he was so high on the suspect list, because he knew so much about the body, and he was a doctor.
Anatomy.
Exactly, and it was just crazy.
Yeah.
It's
that
crazy.
Is insane. And you were telling, the guts over the shoulder. Was there any significance to why he placed, his cuts and the skin and the intestines in those direct spots?
Well, a lot of people, even now, detectives think it was a symbolization of, when you're in a casket and your hands are placed over your chest, the dead pose.
Oh.
The hands, crossed. Even though then others say, well, he could have just moved the hands, but he put half of the intestines on one shoulder, half on the other, sort of spread like a cross is, which obviously made detectives think, was he religious? Was he motivated by religion? But it's never been confirmed, obviously, because we don't know who he was.
That's insane. Oh my gosh.
Detectives and police officers don't actually think that he pre-planned his murders. These victims were most likely chosen on random, and they just happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. He did not know specific details about them or anything. He didn't have any of their stuff in his possession. He hadn't been stalking these women. He was just looking for anyone really who he could find. That got cut really quick from the police officer's investigation, that they were random, and that's what also gave so much awareness to the public, that's why they started putting articles in the newspaper telling women to be careful and watch your surroundings, because we don't have this guy in custody. We don't know, and he's also not planning them. He's also just finding anyone.
And was this because of their occupation?
Yes, so as I said previously in the last episode, they were all prostitutes, and they worked at a lodging house a few streets from Hanbury Street. And the For sure, like, the occupation they had was not respected at the time. It wasn't like, it was looked down on.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And, I mean, prostitution in general, it still is, but back then especially, London was split one half poor, one half rich, you know.
Yeah.
And the East End was a very poor area of London. And even though you're, like, half a mile from one of the richest square miles in the world, it just exposed so many flaws in Victorian society in London because the rich did not do anything to prevent this from happening to the prostitutes here.
Yeah.
You know, the police, I don't want to say they didn't care, because they did care, but they never truly helped prevent these murders from happening. The women weren't safe, and it was, like, it was their line of business, but it wasn't enjoyable.
Yeah. So they practically, like, walked into his trap.
Pretty much.
Because they were looking more for him than he was for them specifically.
Exactly.
Made it even harder for them to track.
Exactly. Like, she was just walking home from, like, a bar and just looking for someone.
Yeah.
She needed money because she can't pay for her rent. And he knew that in his head. He knew that people would be out looking. And so he just put himself in the right place for what he wanted to do.
Yeah, that's
And lure them in.
absolutely satanic.
Yeah, it is. It's sadistic.
Yeah. That just must be why it was so hard to solve, is because
Exactly.
they had no way to run with any evidence.
Yes.
He honestly, everything was done by chance.
Yes. Yes, it was. And it wasn't planned, and it wasn't very, thought out in some ways. The removal of the intestines obviously was thought out and obviously pre-planned in his mind, but the actual kill was never planned. And not every kill was the same MO.
Yeah.
Some throat were slit. Some was
Yeah, that's
and lure them in.
absolutely satanic.
Yeah, it is. It's sadistic.
Yeah. That just must be why it was so hard to solve, is because
Exactly.
they had no way to run with any evidence.
Yes.
He honestly, everything was done by chance.
Yes. Yes, it was. And it wasn't planned, and it wasn't very, thought out in some ways. The removal of the intestines obviously was thought out and obviously pre-planned in his mind, but the actual kill was never planned. And not every kill was the same MO.
Yeah.
Some throat were slit. Some was other strangulation.
Yeah.
And so, yes, that's that. Oh, I forgot to mention that her womb got cut out and he took it with her. Him.
With him?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a little strange.
It's more than a little strange. She also had, like, bruises all over her body. Well, the top half of her body and on her face, which originally the detectives thought Jack the Ripper had beaten her up, either post or pre-mortem. But with later discovery, they realized that she had gotten into an argument with one of her friends, Eliza, at the lodging house, like 3 days prior to her death. And Annie had slapped Eliza across the face.
What?
And then Eliza retaliated and, like, punched her in the face and the chest a few times. And Annie seemed to have the worst of it because she got punched in the eye and the face, which obviously you can see more.
Yeah. Like swelling and all that.
Yes, yeah, her face was all swelled up. And it was over something really stupid. It wasn't
What was it
anything.
over?
Well, it was over a bar of soap.
A bar of... That's crazy.
Yeah, well,
This girl seems to get the worst of it, honestly.
yeah, because Annie had used, like, Eliza's bar of soap and not given it back. So then she got mad. And then she was like, Annie was like, oh, well, be lucky I don't do anything else, after she had slapped her across the face. And then that's when Eliza retaliated.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it was intense for sure.
Yeah.
One of her friends had bumped into her on September 5th and said, obviously, you look really bad, like, what's going on? And Annie had been sick at the time, which is why her injuries were worse than it seemed, because she was sick and she got beat up.
Oh my God.
So, yeah. 3 days after that, on September 7th, her friend saw her on Dorset Street, which was where the lodging house was, and she said she looked even worse, and Annie was saying, like, I don't know, I don't have money, I can't go to a ward or any hospital place because she didn't have enough money. So she ended up going into the streets that night, and that was the night that she got murdered by Jack the Ripper. Yes. So even though she was sick and beat up already, she still struggled against Jack the Ripper and still, fought back against him, which Mary Nichols did not do. So,
dang.
Yeah, she was strong. So to end the episode off, a little spoiler for our next episode is that the next thing Jack the Ripper does is not a murder. It's actually, he sends a letter to the Central News Agency, which was a news agency in London. It is the infamous The Boss letter, which is what he titled it, and this was signed Jack the Ripper. So he actually named himself Jack the Ripper.
Oh.
He obviously didn't give his real name, but so that's where the origin of Jack the Ripper comes from, was actually his own letter that he wrote. Which
oh my gosh.
is interesting, but we are not going to get into that this episode. I'm sorry, Willow.
That's unfortunate.
Yes, but if you are interested in hearing more about that letter and his other victims, please tune into the next episode, which will be coming out very soon.
Oh my gosh, I'll be sure to.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so fun.
I hope I answered all your questions.
Of course. And more.
Yes, of course. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Soph.